Hi, lesson 2, Brambles and Bathsheba. So have you ever had a family, perhaps let me call it a disagreement? As a child, we had no room for disagreement. It was our parents' way. There was no opinion or discussion. And as a parent, I understood slightly that rule, although we allowed our kids to talk about things. And it was a family decision. Sometimes we agreed, sometimes we disagreed. We never had a coup where one child went out to kill each other. There's something about power. So Gideon, we remember him from the Judges, and we remember the amazing things that he did. He destroyed the altars of Baal, and he asked God for signs of fleece. And perhaps for me, one of the greatest lessons learned from Gideon was in Judges 7, where God kept paring down his army and finally arrived at 300 men. Gideon also kept his heart focused on God, especially when the men of Israel asked if he would rule over them. Now, Gideon had delivered them, and they asked Gideon in Judges 8, "Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." You know, the accolades of men change people, and this is a moment for Gideon. They wanted him to be their ruler. And then we read, "But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Gideon deflected the attention from man to God. Now remember when he said, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you"? Gideon must not have sent a memo to his son. But then again, Gideon didn't stay true to God. He had made an ephod, which ended up not what Gideon envisioned, and the people used it for an idol. Eventually, Gideon left the parameters that God encouraged. Gideon had many wives, and that ended up with 70 sons. Probably a lot more daughters. That is not a recipe for a happy 4th of July picnic. So there's an old saying that says, 1 boy is a boy, 2 boys be half a boy, 3 boys be no boy at all. Now what could that be with 70 boys? Well, according to my husband, you'd be in a big hole big time. It also involved pagan wives, and as we see in the next chapters, Gideon did not impart his wisdom for worshiping God. Before the end of the chapter, it says the country was quiet for 40 years. You know, 40 years changes things. 40 years we go through wars. We do incredible things with sending people to the moon and planets, and computers change over. A lot happens in 40 years. That brings us to Gideon dying, and the children of Israel went back to their ways with Baal. They forgot that God had delivered them. They forgot or intentionally put God on that back burner. You know, that's what happens when we forget where we've been. So Judges 9, one of Gideon's son, one of the 70, was called Abimelech. We don't know how old he was or anything else except he had an idea. And the people Abimelech hadn't given up on this idea of a king. So Abimelech came up with a great idea. He went to his mother's family in Shechem and talked to them about the son of Gideon ruling over them. And he was a son of Gideon, and he capped it off with, "Remember, I am your own flesh and bone." So they decided that was a good idea and gave him money. With the money, Abimelech hired a bunch of worthless, reckless men, great role models, and they went and killed 68 of his brothers. Almost 69, but the one ran away and escaped. Now this is done in history. Whoever wants to be the head honcho kills the competitors. So if a son of Gideon would make a great ruler, and there were 70 sons, then the sure way is to kill off the rest, and you're the only one left. It doesn't matter if you are qualified or not qualified. So Gideon had one son who must have listened to the words that Gideon had lived by in his earlier God-seeking days. And this is where we come to the parable in the Judges. Jotham, the brother that hid and thus his life was spared, was told what Abimelech did. This is his response. Judges 9, 8 through 15. It's called the parable of the trees. Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood on the Mount Gerizim and lifted his voice and cried out. And he said, "Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them, and they went to the olive tree, 'Reign over us,' they said. But the olive tree said to them, 'Should I cease giving my oil with which they honor God and man and go sway over trees?' Well, then the trees said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.' But the fig tree said to them, 'Should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit and go to sway over trees?' And then the tree said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.' But the vine said to them, should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and man, and go sway over trees? Then the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you appoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Well, what we see here is Abimelech had an opportunity and saw an opportunity to seize power. We see that a lot in our political system today. We see it in our churches. Power changes people. So there's a quote. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. That's attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure if it actually came from him. But it's true. Power changes people, and the quest for power propels people to do things others wouldn't dare to do. So how do we apply this to our life? Well, we want a king. We all kind of want a king. We make idols of everything we have around us. But what about the things that were represented in the parable? Well, let's look at the olive tree, the fig tree, and the grapevine. Now, these all were worth a lot. The olive tree and its oil, what it produced, they were valuable. Oil was crucial to their economy. The olive oil was part of the daily living of the Hebrew people, so it was important for lighting, and for cooking, and for medicine, and then they used it for a moisturizer on their hands, body. The oil was used for also anointing kings and prophets and priests. The wood from the olive tree was also used for carving, and in 1 Kings it talks about the olive tree wood being used in Solomon's temple. And then we have the fig trees, and they were also very valuable. They represented national wealth and prosperity. So we first see the fig trees in the Garden of Eden. The trees took a long time to grow, and they were a sign of blessing and security for those who took the time to care for them. Then we have the grapevine. Grapevines are mentioned more than any other plant in the Bible. It was very, very central to their life. The hedge it provided helped with security. The grapes produced could be eaten fresh or dried. And of course, then they pressed it for wine and for vinegar. So Jotham used these in this parable, comparing three things that were very valuable, but also he used three things that knew their worth. And then he used the brambles. Brambles are to Israel what buckthorn is to our woods. The brambles represent a thick, dense growth that takes over and basically renders your land useless. A bramble is a dry, thorny bush. It's invasive and it's offensive. It's a weed. It's suitable only for the machete and the bonfire. So compared to the usefulness of the olive trees, fig trees, and grapevine, the bramble is far from being compared. That would be like me saying I'm going to go one-on-one with Shaq on the basketball court. It would be an embarrassing comparison. And that's what this parable is. Humans tend to look at the things that have value and gravitate to the things that meet our earthly desires and wants, rather than being driven to the Heavenly Father for things that are worthwhile and eternal. So what can we take away from this? How can we look at who am I and what is the elephant in the living room and how do I apply this? Well, let's look at the elements, because each of the elements of the parable knew their worth. The vine, the fig, the olive tree, they knew their worth, and their value was not in bossing somebody else around. So the people in our story, we have the elements. We have Gideon, we have the families on both sides, we have Abimelech, we have Jotham, we have the children of Israel. Then we have fig trees, grapevines, olive trees, and brambles. Gideon followed God and trusted God. The families, some fell in line with Abimelech. Well, maybe they were easily coerced, or maybe they just didn't see any other option. Focusing on the wrong thing can lead us to assume things. So God was forgotten, and the God who led them through so much was forgotten. When we forget God, we look at options that seem right in our own eyes. Now, the two families were not in the same camp. Abimelech learned very young to manipulate, and that maybe comes from being one of many, many children. How do our families respond to situations that present themselves? Do we look at the bigger picture? Do we ask questions? Do we just go with the easiest suggestions so there aren't any issues? So either the other sons trusted Abimelech or didn't have boundaries. His enlisting of others so easily to murder his siblings. But in our lives, when do we bring in others to deal with family issues, and does it backfire? And we end up in World War III. So the elephant in the living room, I see so many moments where I see Abimelechs in life and I don't know what to do about it. How does one take up arms against someone who's manipulative, and especially someone with power? And then there's Jotham. Do I run and hide? Do I eloquently state the issue? Do I stand up against those who power over others? How do I equip others around me to do what we can so we don't feel powerless? And what boundaries have I put in place so that I don't look at the things of life and want them more than letting God rule? Maybe the bigger question is, am I willing to just scoop the poop up from the elephant? Or do I really want to get the elephant out of my life? Sometimes we don't know how to deal with people who manipulate and power over our lives, so we just let them continue to ruin our lives and destroy people. And Paul talks about in the New Testament dealing with churches and people and power and struggle. Maybe we need to just go examine some of those prison epistles and how he dealt with churches. But the bigger question is, how do I change? What do I change depends on how I'm bothered by the brambles. Worthless things in life that choke my life out become a part of me, so I just think they're as normal as a grapevine and an olive tree. I think they have wealth. I think they have worth. What bothers me, is it enough to change my perspective? Jotham didn't make a big difference, but he spoke the truth. And sometimes that's what we're called to do, and let others think about the truth before we give up and just accept what's happening. So a few things maybe to take away from the parable: that God should always be our ruler. It's kind of what Gideon said. God will always be our ruler. Selfish ambition usually leads to dominating others and doesn't end well. Now, Abimelech died at the hands of a woman tossing a rock in his head. Ironically, it was his own kinship, the Shechemites, that paid him to be their ruler, that killed him. And because of his pride, he asked his armor bearer to put a sword through him so he wouldn't go down in history being killed by a woman. Pride leads to a crash. That leads to the last thing we need to watch for in life is leadership, life-starving leadership. Brambles dictate and rule. Godly leadership honors people. So be a leader that respects people. Be a leader that honors God. Be a leader that seeks to love people and use things. Now, the second Old Testament parable we're just going to touch lightly is one we know. It's David and Bathsheba, and the parable that Nathan shared with David. So we're going to go to 2 Timothy 12. The Lord sent Nathan to David, and when he came to them, he said, "Now there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now the traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." The story's done, and David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." And then Nathan says to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house to you, your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took Uriah, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." So what happens when people tell you they want to talk to you privately about something? Well, if you're like me, you kind of get all defensive and get all excited, and you don't know what they're going to say, and you go through everything you've done. What have I said? What have I said? The waiting for somebody to talk to us and spill their heart. When we begin talking, when they begin talking, I should say, we get very defensive, or I should say I become defensive, and I find reasons to justify my actions or my words. Human nature is like that. David would have been no different. So God led Nathan to speak in a language that moved the king's heart, and that was a parable. We all have soft spots in our heart for pets, and I don't think it was any different back then. But let's tear apart really how Nathan approached David. The backstory is David taking Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, having sex with her, then sending her back home. When she finds out she's pregnant, David brings her warrior husband home to make it look good. He refuses to go to her, and so David has to have him murdered. Now, how much time lapsed, we really don't know. But we can make some guesses. So we know an approximate time of pregnancy is 9 months. She knew she was pregnant 2 or 3 months. So there was time to plan and murder Uriah, kind of undetermined. The time of mourning, according to Jewish custom, would have been anywhere from 30 days to a year. We know it couldn't have been a year because she went to be David's wife and then bore the child. So common sense would say it was probably 30 days or a month of mourning. The word used in 2 Samuel to describe the age of the child when it became ill after Nathan's prophecy is, according to tradition, a child is named on the 8th day. So the child, according to 2 Samuel, it said on the 7th day the child died. The child is consistently referred to as a child and not a name, and that would lead us to conclude the naming of the child really hadn't happened yet. So this is very fresh in David's mind. The taking of Bathsheba, the pregnancy, the deceit, the murder, taking Bathsheba to be his wife, and then the baby's born. And then here comes Nathan, and he's not bringing a baby gift. He's bringing a story. We do listen to stories better than accusations, and we seem to take to heart, personalize, and then we get involved emotionally. Nathan used the story to get David's attention, and then he turned it on David. It wasn't long after the story because it just simply says, after Nathan went home, the Lord struck the child. So the story ends there, but what do we get out of the parable? Well, I would be the first to say that I am not like David. I have not taken anybody's lamb or horse. I haven't cheated on my husband, and I haven't killed anybody. So, do I relate to David and what he has done? Because I just found a way to justify the things that I do, and I found a way to look on the ladder of sin, and mine's not as bad as David's. Nathan took the parable and put in what David had done in a way that spoke to David's heart. And when David pointed out that he was that rich, was pointed out he was the rich man, he was the king, his heart was pricked. Do I let my heart get pricked? Does God find a way to talk to my heart so I identify with it and let the Holy Spirit speak to me? Of course, he doesn't have prophets that come to my house and tell me stories. But he does have people and situations in everyday life to speak to us in ways to get our attention. So we have the two parables. We have the brambles and we have Bathsheba. And in those two parables, we see the wisdom of the three things that have value. Knowing where their worth is, knowing that they weren't worth, they had more important things to do than to reign over trees, sway over trees. They knew what they were gifted at. They knew what God had called them to do. And then we have the brambles, and brambles grow up and choke people out, choke things out. Other things can't grow. Are we one of the three that have wealth, worth, and know what we're good at and know what God has called us? Or are we a bramble that just go around choking people and coming up with crazy ideas? And when we think about David and Bathsheba, David could have had a stop sign at many different places. He could have had boundaries. He was going downhill fast, but he could have put on the brakes. Do we have boundaries and brakes in our life to help us make good decisions? He should have been at war. He shouldn't have been up on the rooftop. He shouldn't have called for Bathsheba. A lot of the shouldn't haves. But when you're going downhill quickly, it's hard to stop. So do we have boundaries and brakes? Things to think about. Have a good one. So some discussion questions and things to think about. So we have those three questions that we talk about. Who am I in the parable? What's the elephant in the living room, or what's the topic? What's the theme? And how do I apply it? So when we think about, especially in the first parable, we have Abimelech. We have Gideon. Gideon followed God. Gideon did amazing things for God. We have Abimelech, which is one of his 70 sons. We have Jotham. We have the brothers. We have families on both sides. And then we have the elements of the parable. So we have the fig tree, the olive trees and the vineyard, and then we have brambles. So which ones are we? Are we Gideon, who leads a wonderful godly life but doesn't pass on or doesn't quite get the story to other people in our life that matter? Are we Abimelech who seizes an opportunity to manipulate? And though Gideon had said, I will never be king and rule over you, my son will never be king and rule over you, Abimelech didn't get the memo. And then we have Jotham, who ran for his life, but then he came back and spoke the truth. And then we have the families. So we have the brothers. Now, did they just really trust Abimelech, or did they not know what to do? Were they totally blindsided? We have his mother's side of the family, which is the Shechemites, and they were easily believed in him to pay money and then go murder everybody. Do we find ourselves in situations where we go along with someone who's doing the wrong, but we're not really sure how to confront or get out of it? And then we have the elements. So when we think about the fig tree, the olive tree, and the grapevine, it's very obvious in the parable they knew what they were good at. They knew what they were blessed by God at, and they knew what their contribution to life was. So they understood they were called to do a certain thing. They felt no reason to step out of their calling to do something else. The interesting part of those three is they were probably more competent and had more ability to be king. And they represent the things in life that are good decisions. And then the bramble, which represents Abimelech, is the worthless, no good, no value that seems to take precedent and speak up louder and cause more attention than the wise who know what they're gifted in. And brambles aren't afraid to step in where angels fear to tread. They're deceiving, they're manipulative, and they're out to destroy. So when you look at those, we've probably been all of them at one point in time. But how do we relate? Do we know what we're gifted at? Do we know what we're good at? And we're not willing to compromise and try something that other people want us to do, but we know is not God asking us to do. Are we the Abimelechs who just blunder through and want their own way and get it no matter who gets hurt? Are we the Jothams who run and hide, but then come speak truth? Are we the families who totally feel caught in the middle and don't know what to do? Interesting things to think about. So then we have the elephant in the living room. Now, who do we trust? So Abimelech must have been very conniving, very manipulative. And we know people like that, who they can sell a freezer to an Eskimo. You live in Alaska, you just put your stuff outside, but nope, they can sell a freezer. We know people like that. Do we listen to them? How well do we look at leadership and applaud, encourage the ones who are quality leaders? The fig trees, the olive trees, the vineyards. How well do we come alongside and encourage them? And how often do we stand up to the brambles? Seems the brambles are just going to run over people, and that is the Jotham. We run and hide because we're going to get hurt. How many times do we agree with a bad plan because we don't see another option? And we feel helpless. And then the Shechem woman. The elephant in the living room is someone is doing wrong, and who can stop them? Well, the Shechem woman dropped a rock on his head. Interestingly enough, it was the Shechemites who paid money to help him be a leader over them. So how often do we stand up with a rock and say enough is enough? Stop. And the elephant in the living room, sometimes we're just more comfortable to scoop up the poop than we are to try to get the elephant out of the living room. Godly leadership is one of the things I think that they're talking about. And we don't applaud it enough, and we don't stand up to poor leadership strong enough. And how does this apply to my life? Well, sometimes we let the brambles get more, speak more authority into our hearts than the others. And we need to look at who's speaking authority into our life, who's talking to us. Is it the Jothams or is it the Abimelechs? Do we take the advice of people that are proven, that have value in life, like the fig tree, like the olive tree, like the grapevine, things that have established as worth? Or do we listen to the Abimelechs, who just talk fast and run shot over people? What am I willing to sacrifice? And Jotham ran and hid for his life, and he was willing to stand up on top and give a parable. And the Shechemites finally stood up for what and stopped evil. When I'm with poor leadership, what's my reaction? And it's hard because often we feel like we really don't have an option. But with every Abimelech, with every bramble, we have the fig trees, the olive trees, and the vineyards. And there was 3 wise to 1 foolish. And God's wisdom should overcome the Abimelechs in the world, as the end of the story ended up being. Now let's jump into David. Now, in this story, who am I? We have David. We have a king. We have Bathsheba, seemingly an innocent bystander. We have the messengers who came and went. Go get her, take her back, go to war, get him, bring him back, go put him in front, pull your army back, he'll be dead. Those are people caught totally in the middle. And then we have Nathan, the one who came to tell a story. So if we think about it, there's a lot of questions as to why David was in the place he was. And at any time, David could have put the brakes on. He wasn't at war. He should have been at war. He was not sleeping in the middle of the night, so he got up and walked up on his roof. Not a bad thing to do. And then he saw Bathsheba taking a bath. Okay, now you start having decisions. He could have turned away. He could have not summoned her. Any time in that procedure, he could have put a stop sign up. He could have put the brakes on. And then there's Bathsheba. Sometimes we put ourselves in situations, probably not uncommon in that day, to be taking a bath on the roof. But there's times we put ourselves in situations that we didn't really cause it, but we were a part of it. Now, for the king, does she have any ability to say no? Back in that culture, probably not. But sometimes we put ourselves in situations that we wouldn't have got into the trouble we did if we just hadn't done what we did, not been where we were. And we have Uriah also, who was a totally innocent bystander, but stood up for the principle he believed in, and that was if his buddies were at war, he was not going to enjoy the pleasures of his wife. And he was one of those innocent bystanders that's what happened, was he was murdered. And then we have Nathan, who was God's messenger. So we can be kind of any one of those people at any given time. We can be the one that should be putting the stop sign on. We could be the one who maybe could think about our actions. We could be the messengers caught in the middle, or we could be the one confronting. So what's the elephant in the living room? And I think one of the elephants is our human nature is to conceal and then tell a lie about it. And every lie David lied had to cover up something else he had to do to cover up what he did. So the sin of taking another woman, the pregnancy, just kept trying to cover it up. And God talks through families and friends. And sometimes the elephants in the living room, we just don't want to give them a chance to talk because we don't want to hear what they have to say. So when people come and say, something I want to talk to you about, we need to be humble and receive it. And as Nathan, we need to be praying for the words to share so that they're received well. We don't handle accusations well. I don't think you're any different than I am. Someone accuses us of something, we bristle up, and we're going to come up with a way to not make us look as bad. It's just human nature. So how do we go beyond our human nature to our godly nature and listen and accept criticism, accept the truth, and then figure out how we can make it right? And the last thing is, how do we apply that to our world today? Number one is have boundaries. Have boundaries and stop signs. Have people that you trust to where if they see you going down a hill and you're going too fast, have the authority in your life to put up a stop sign. Say stop, think about it, brakes. David had no boundaries and no brakes, and he crashed. We need to be able to have people that surround us that we can be honest with, that we can be truthful with. And we need to be willing to be Nathan, to go and sit and talk to someone's heart in a way that they will listen. That's not always easy to do, and it's not always easy to find the words to do, but we need to be willing to do it. We need to make sure, number one, that Gideon's statement that God would be the only one to rule over you would be in our lives the actions that are produced. If David would have remembered God is the only one to rule over me, he would have had boundaries and breaks. Something to think about. Thanks.